Alright, guys, we are on chapter 21 of Hidden Figures. This is called Out of the Past, the Future. Sending a man into space was a tall order, but it was part about returning him safely to Earth that kept Katherine Johnson and the rest of the Langley employees awake at night. There was countless ways that things could go wrong, and they needed to be ready for each one. The rocket had to operate flawlessly. The Atlantis rocket was going to be used to take the Mercury capsule into orbit, but it was temperamental. 2 of its 5 previous launches had ended in failure. One rocket had surged into the sky and then exploded in midair. There seemed to be an infinity number of things that could go wrong with the spacecraft. The space capsule itself was a sophisticated tin can, but one that required elaborate engineering. The vehicle's oxygen and pressurization system were all that stood between the life-crushing vacuum of space and the person riding inside it. If the capsule wasn't strong enough to withstand the intense forces of the launch, it would explode. Every wire, every switch, every gauge, every component had to be tested and retested to make sure it worked flawlessly. Success depended on the engineer's mastery of the laws of physics and mathematics. The spacecraft demanded extreme persistence and accuracy. Even a simple error would have catastrophic consequences. There seemed to be an infinite number of ways things could go wrong, and only one way that things could go right. America's astronaut. Nobody understood the risk of spaceflight better than the astronaut John Glenn. The former U.S. Marine Corps test pilot had been chosen as the astronaut for America's first orbital flight. He pushed his body to the physical limit to prepare for the mission, and he worked tirelessly on the simulators and trainers, preparing for every failure scenario the engineers could imagine. He knew that his life depended on his readiness. As a pilot, Glenn knew that the only way to remove all risk was to cancel the mission. He understood that he had likely to encounter some unforeseen problems, so he did his best to be ready for them. The preparations took longer than expected, and Project Mercury's launch was pushed back from late 1960 to July of 1961 and then to 1962. The Russians didn't slow down. In August of 1961, they completed a 17-orbit flight, nearly a full day in space. The Soviet success put even more pressure on NASA to get a mission off the ground. In addition to the technical challenges, the launch team had to deal with the weather. Overcast skies at the Cape Canaveral, Florida, delayed takeoff on 2 more dates. Finally, the date was set, February 20th, 1962. John Glenn handled the delays with patience and grace. He stayed in top condition and remained focused. Before taking off, he asked engineers to complete one more check. He asked them to double-check the math that had been done by the electronic computers. Many of the astronauts didn't fully trust the electronic number crunchers machines. As former test pilots, they staked their reputation and their life on maintaining constant and direct control over their planes. A tiny error in judgment or a second of delay could mean disaster. The Mercury mission linked the spacecraft with the electronic computers on the ground. The astronauts worried, what if the computer lost power or seized up during the flight? When the Space Task Group bought more powerful computers, the equations were programmed into the machine so that they could automatically guide and control the rocket and send information about the capsule position back to mission control. If the rocket misfired and sent the capsule into an incorrect orbit, the computer would alert the flight controllers, who had the power to abort the mission. The capsule would detach from the rocket and land safely into sea, where the astronaut could be rescued. Once successfully launched, the capsule would push through the atmosphere and settle into orbit. It would separate from the rocket and establish new communication connections with the ground stations. The spacecraft would send data back to the track stations, which would capture the signals with their 64-foot receiving dishes. The Goddard Space Center in Maryland would also send Mission Control in Texas data about the spaceship's position. Hovering over the giant map of the world at Mission Control was a little cutout of the Mercury capsule, suspended on a wire. As data came into Mission Control, the image of the capsule would move across the map. While it was an unsophisticated map by today's standards, at the time it helped the engineers follow the flight's path. The capsule signal would bounce from one tracking station to another as it moved. The data would allow the controllers to ask, Where was the capsule compared to when they had calculated it to be at a given time? Was it too high? Was it too low? Was it too slow or too fast? They will constantly refine their data and make adjustments. This information would be used to determine exactly where the capsule's rocket should fire to bring the safe spacecraft back to Earth. For the mission to succeed, the hardwire, the software, and the human beings had to properly function. A breakdown in any component would be tragic, and it would all unfold on live television. The human computers crunching numbers were something that the astronauts understood and trusted. The women mathematicians dominated their medical calculators the same way that the test pilots dominated their plane. Spacecraft flying computers might be the future, but John Glenn didn't have it trust in them. He did trust a human computer, Katherine Johnson. Get the girl to check the numbers, Glenn said. If Katherine Johnson said the numbers are good, I'm ready to go. The countdown. The space age and the television age were coming into their own at the space-time. NASA understood that they were making history and that events taking place should be broadcasted to the world and recorded for history. The agency sent a film crew to each of the tracking stations, recording the communications teams as they completed their pre-flight checkouts. The footage showed the second-by-second drama in mission control as white men in white shirts and black ties faced long desks with communication consoles. Headphones on, serious expressions on their face, the men stared up at the enormous electronic map of the world on the wall in front of them. Because of her close work relationship with the pioneers of the Space Task Group, it was Katherine Johnson who found herself in the position to make the most immediate contribution to the Mercury mission. When the phone call came in to Katherine Johnson's office at Langley, she was sitting at her desk. She overheard the call with the engineer who picked up. She knew she was the girl being discussed on the phone conversation. Astronaut John Glenn didn't know her name, but she was the one talking about when he wanted someone to double-check the numbers. Katherine knew the numbers he meant, the ones that describe the orbital mission around Earth, just like her first research report, the one she had worked on with the engineer, Ted. In the final section of the report, Katherine had calculated by hand 2 different sample orbits, plugging numbers into equations in the report. Then she compared her results to the results from the IBM electronic computer, which had been programmed to calculate the same questions. At the time, it turned out that there was very good agreement between the IBM's output and Katherine's calculations. Katherine and the machine got the same numbers. This work double-checking the electronic computers was a dress rehearsal for the work that was now required, checking the numbers not for the sample orbit, but for the real mission, with an astronaut on board. Confidence. Though Katherine Johnson didn't usually panic in stressful situations, she was very nervous about the task in front of her. But she was confident in her math skills, so she organized herself at a desk. Thick stacks of data sheets and equations surrounded her workspace. Instead of generating numbers and sending them to be checked by the computer, Katherine worked in reverse. She took the data from the computer and ran it through her own calculations. She wanted to see very good judgment between her numbers and those generated by the computer. Katherine worked through every minute of the 3-orbit mission. It took a day and a half of watching the numbers pile up until she completed the task. When she delivered the data sheet to the Project Mercury engineer, she had no doubt that her numbers were correct. February 20th, 1962. February 20th, 1962 dawned bright and clear, and 135 million people turned in to watch the launch unfold on live television. Katherine Johnson sat in the office, breathlessly watching the news coverage. At 9:47 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, the Atlantis rocket boosted Friendship 7 into orbit. Ground control cleared John Glenn for 7 orbits around the Earth. During the first orbit, the capsule's automatic control system began to act up, causing the capsule to pull back and forth like a badly aligned car. Glenn smoothed it out by switching the system to manual and acting as if he were flying a plane. At the end of the second orbit, a warning light indicated the heat shield was loose. A heat shield in the outer covering on the spacecraft that protects it from extreme heat when the craft re-enters Earth's atmosphere. Without that firewall, there was nothing standing between Glenn and the 3,000-degree temperatures, almost as hot as the surface of the sun. This would build up around the capsule as it passed back into the Earth's atmosphere. Mission Control had a solution. At the end of the third orbit, after the retro rockets fired, Glenn was to keep the rocket pack attached to the spacecraft instead of getting rid of it as was standard procedure. The NASA engineers hoped that the rocket would keep the loose-held shield in place. At 4 hours and 33 minutes into flight, the rockets fired. John Glenn adjusted the capsule to the correct position, and he waited. The spaceship slowed down and pulled out its orbit, heading down. At this point, the most dangerous part of the re-entry, the signals flickered, then went silent. There was no signal from Friendship 7. The engineers tried to figure out what had gone wrong, but there was nothing Mission Control could do. Silence. 1 minute passed. 2 minutes. 3 minutes. Everyone feared the worst, that the heat shield had failed and the spacecraft had been burned. The team struggled to reconnect with the spacecraft. 10 minutes passed, 11 minutes, 12 minutes, 13. 14 minutes after the signal silenced, John Glenn's voice returned. He was alive. The spaceship continued the spaceship continued with the computer predicting a perfect landing. When Friendship 7 splashed down, it was off target by just 40 miles, and the minor error was only because the estimated weight of the capsule during re-entry included the added weight of the rocket that had remained in the plane. The computers, both electronic and human, had worked flawlessly. 21 minutes after landing, astronaut John Glenn was safely out of the water. John Glenn was a hero. He had an audience with the president, a ticket trade parade in New York, and from Maine to Moscow, large newspaper headings cheering for him. The African-American press cheered him on. All of us are happy to call him our ace of space. Nowhere was the hero's welcome as warm as the Hampton Roads, Virginia. 30,000 local residents turned out in mid-March to celebrate the man they considered their hometown hero. Glenn rode in the lead vehicle of a 50-car parade that included the Mercury astronauts and their families. The 22-mile route went from Hampton and Newport News. The parade ended at a stadium where Glenn stood behind a podium with a sign reading, Spacetown, USA. The city Hampton changed its official seal to a crab holding a Mercury capsule in its claw. It adopted the motto, E Presidency Futura, out of the past, the future. I don't think I read that correctly, but out of the past, the future is what it means. John Glenn wasn't the only one being cheered. Word of Katherine Johnson's role in the mission made the rounds in the African-American community. On March 10, 1962, a photograph of Katherine Johnson was featured on the front page of the Pittsburgh newspaper. The caption read, "Her name, in case you haven't already guessed, is Katherine Johnson. Mother, wife, career woman." The article recounted Katherine's contribution to the work that sent Glenn's rocket through the sky. Johnson attended the Hampton Parade, allowing herself just a moment of pride at having been part of such an accomplishment. She didn't stay too long. She wanted to recognize the hard work and success of the team. But there was nothing more exhilarating for her than getting back to work and on to the next assignments. So how does it make you feel reading this chapter that Katherine Johnson, started barely being able to work in the office and work in the NACA, to actually being the person to calculate the numbers for the spacecraft to go into the air and come back down?